This video is going to look at basically what happens when glucose homeostasis goes wrong. In particular, we're going to look at diabetes generally, and then the rest of this video will focus on diabetes type 1. So the full name for diabetes is actually diabetes mellitus, and this is derived from a Greek term from mellitus, which means honey, and basically refers to the fact that people that had this disease way back in ancient Greek times had very, very sweet urine, and it's maybe a not so commonly known fact, but up until very recently, in fact probably in the 18th century, maybe even early 19th century, there was a specific group of people that called themselves physicians that went around and they diagnosed people with diabetes based on the taste of their urine. So they would actually taste somebody else's urine to see if they had diabetes or not, which is actually less unhygienic than you think, because urine is actually a sterile liquid until it leaves your body. So it actually isn't as terrible as that sounds. But anyway, apparently this is the fun fact. We're going to look at the reason that it does become so sweet, but the main reason is that the glucose is not being reabsorbed back into the body or into the tissues, and therefore the excess is being excreted in the urine, and that's why you get all this glucose being released as waste in urine. A quick overview of some of the consequences that can come about if your blood glucose remains high for a long time, and these are considered to be diabetic complications. So there's a couple of tricky words in here, and what you will notice is that most of them, as you can see here, they all end in pathy, and pathy basically means disease of something. So that's why when you talk about pathology, it's the department that looks at disease or things like that, okay? So retinopathy is disease of the retina. Okay, and we talked about that in one of the earlier videos, but you can see some images down here. Look, gangrene comes up again, so go Google self-amputating toes and see what happens. Damages to nerve, and so that can be neuropathy. So neuro meaning nerve, pathy, disease of the nerves. And that can also mean that people can't feel their extremities anymore, like fingers and toes, and that can actually also contribute to damage to toes and basically not looking after your extremities very well. You can also get damage to kidneys, which is nephropathy, so that's disease of the nephrons, being that functional unit of the kidney. And basically people that are on dialysis, and it's becoming way more common than it used to be, most of them are on dialysis because of diabetes causing damage to their kidneys. Also related to this is coronary artery disease, and the proper name for this is atherosclerosis. And if over time coronary artery disease, remembering that coronary arteries are the little tiny arteries that supply our heart muscle itself with a blood supply and oxygen supply, and if they get clogged up, then that can cause heart attacks, and that can often be a way that a lot of diabetics end up dying from it. Interesting to note too, they talk about ulcers down here in this lovely, lovely picture down the bottom of the page. And these ulcers often won't heal very well because they don't have a very good blood supply back to the skin. So the bacteria can get in there and you haven't got any immune cells coming along to fight it off. So not very nice. So this is extra information that you do not need, and to be honest, this is really common sense kind of stuff. So there is a special little thing down here, a measurement of how much glucose has been in your system over a long period of time, and this is this HbA1c, and it's just a marker, or basically a specific thing that a test can pick up for, and it can tell you how much glucose has been in your blood over a long period of time. Now often when people with diabetes, if they're not managing their disease very well, they will eat whatever they like and not do exercise and things like that, and then when they know that an appointment with their doctor is coming up, all of a sudden they will start eating well, and they will exercise, and they will try and get their blood sugars back down again. But this little marker here doesn't lie, and it tells the story over a long period of time. And so it's been quite interesting to sort of get around the data of people that were trying to fudge their own results with their doctor so they didn't get told off. But regardless of that, this information is simply saying that if you have prolonged periods of high blood glucose in your blood, you are more likely to end up with damage to your eyes, your kidneys, and your nerves. So very much common sense. However, being scientists, we know that we need to rely upon data. So this is the data that tells us what we've just been talking about. So there are two general main reasons for diabetes occurring. The first one is that you have a insufficient level of insulin present, and this can be zero insulin present, or it can just be not enough insulin present. And this is what type 1 diabetes is. So it's actually a lack of insulin. And if you remember that the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans are responsible for producing insulin, and so we'll come into a bit more detail about them in a moment. There is a second type of diabetes though, and that is that the insulin is present, but it's unable to function. And what that means is that the cells that insulin is meant to be passing this message onto are actually not receptive to that message. And so we can say that the receptors they're not working, they're not detecting that the insulin is there. So it's almost pointless having the insulin. And this is actually what happens in type 2 diabetes. We're going to look at a lot more detail about type 2 diabetes in the next video. This is just a little quick recap relating what we already know to type 1 diabetes mellitus. So there is our pancreas. We know alpha cells are producing glucagon, and remember that is the hormone that promotes glucose being released from the liver, so being transformed from glycogen back to glucose, and so it's released. And it does that in the presence of low blood sugar. And the beta cells, these are the ones that are producing insulin, and these are the ones that promote uptake of glucose by cells. And so it's these ones here, these little brown ones that they're showing here in this diagram. These are the cells that end up getting destroyed in type 1 diabetes mellitus, and therefore the pancreas loses the ability to produce insulin. So type 1 diabetes has been known about for a really long time, but it's only been quite recently, maybe within the last decade or two, that this disease has started being associated with an autoimmune reaction. So autoimmune, let's break up that word. Auto is kind of to yourself or by yourself, and immune is referring to your immune system. So basically, people that have autoimmune diseases, it's when your immune system attacks your own body and actually ends up destroying your own cells, simply because there've been some kind of faulty communication there or faulty recognition of cells, and your immune system thinks that the cell it is attacking is some kind of foreign invader, but it's not, it's actually your own cells. Autoimmune diseases are actually very common, and this is just one of them. They do think that there's obviously some kind of genetic predisposition, so there's something in your genes that says you're more likely to be susceptible to this, and there is also other evidence that suggests some kind of exterior influence, like a viral infection, might also be involved in triggering off this reaction against the beta cells. And this doesn't occur overnight, so this destruction of these beta cells can happen over several years, but your body tends to cope with that for a little bit. And so when finally you lose this ability to produce insulin, you can actually end up developing these symptoms very quickly, and they can be quite serious and quite bad for the individual. So type 1 diabetes is actually not very common. If you consider all of the diabetes cases, so most of these are going to actually be type 2 diabetes, and there's only about 10% of cases that are type 1 diabetes, and they do tend to be the most severe, mostly because you have no insulin, as opposed to type 2, where it's just that your cells are not quite responding as they should be. Generally, this is developed by about the age of 16, and so that means that if you develop type 1 diabetes, your autoimmune reaction to destroy these cells is occurring slowly in childhood, and it generally shows up by the age of 16. So New Zealand stats, about 1 in 300. It's interesting looking over here that this is just a simple way of diagnosing diabetes based on fasting blood glucose test. And so what they do is fasting is not eating. So basically you will not eat for 12 hours and then you go and get your blood tested and they will see how much glucose is present in your blood. So if you're normal, it's actually going to be reasonably low because your body is using up that glucose. The insulin is telling your cells to absorb it. And you're basically, all of the glucose that you ate previously has been taken up by the cells for the most part. So you're being regulated at a nice volume. If you are entering a pre-diabetic stage, so in other words, either your beta cells are starting to fail or things are just not quite working right, then your blood glucose after fasting will be slightly elevated, simply because that insulin message of absorbing glucose is not getting through. And diabetes mellitus is an extremely, well, much higher level of blood glucose, so over 126, a lovely unit up here, milligrams per deciliter. And this is because even though you haven't eaten for 12 hours, the signal is not getting through to your cells to absorb that glucose so that your cells can use it. This is information that we've already talked about, so I'll just very quickly skip through this. A couple of interesting things here. Originally it was called juvenile onset diabetes simply because type 1 diabetes always generally showed up during childhood, and so there's its name. Interesting to note, well, not interesting, not for these poor people, but if they are not treated with insulin, as happened synthetic insulin production days, they do die simply because that glucose cannot get where it is meant to be, and the cells are not, being able to manage that glucose, and so these people become very, very ill. Okay, just running through a couple of the symptoms. So basically, we'll start at number 1 and go through, but you're not going to have glucose as a source of energy, okay? So remember that some cell types like muscle and fat cells are able to use up fats and amino acids in order to produce glucose that the brain can then use, but the brain in particular can only use glucose, so it's not very flexible in terms of that. Kidneys, you are going to end up peeing out an awful lot of glucose, okay? And as well as peeing out the glucose, if you think about in terms of osmosis, that higher concentration of solute in the urine being excreted will attract more water to it, okay? And so that means that the volume of urine is actually going to increase, and that's known as polyuria. So mini urine, mini urines. It's an easy way to remember it. Over here, number 3, to compensate for that, you end up being super, super thirsty. So you are basically drinking all of the time, and this is known as polydipsia. And you also end up getting very hungry because even though you are eating, your body cannot make use of this glucose, and that is known as polyphagia. And finally, you end up losing weight as well, simply because your body is becoming malnourished even though you're eating. Muscles can't use glucose, ends up breaking down amino acids. Amino acids make up protein. And so those muscles are going to end up getting very weak and depleted, and you'll get tired. You also end up metabolizing fats rather than glucose immediately. And one of the things that happens when you metabolize fats is that it produces this byproduct, which is called ketone bodies, and we'll look at that shortly. But these ketone bodies, when they get into the blood, they actually make the blood very acidic, and this is called ketosis. And this is actually what can kill diabetics quite frequently, is this acidic pH. Interestingly enough as well, if you are burning fats to produce glucose, you actually get almost like a smell of acetone on your breath. So by smelling your breath, you can actually pick up whether you're likely to have insulin as well. Insulin deficiencies as well. Finally, because you are peeing out all of this sugary material, that is prime conditions for bacteria and fungus to grow in, and so you're more likely to get urine infections and even kidney infections. Okay, so this is just recapping again, but it's got a lovely little number in here. So there's this functional number which is saying that when you get your blood glucose above that, so that is 20 millimolar per 120 milligrams per deciliter, or basically the same kind of thing, so it's just this level here. Your kidneys are not able to reabsorb all of that glucose, and so instead it spills out into the urine, and we talked about this here too. So having extra glucose or solutes in your urine creates this osmotic kind of pressure, and it's going to end up dragging water back out of the kidneys as well, and therefore you get lots of urine being secreted. And thirst comes about because of that, so that you need to replace those liquids, which is also a symptom of diabetes. Okay, so treatments. Generally, the only way to treat type 1 diabetes is that you need to add back insulin, okay? And so you will find that people with type 1 diabetes will be injecting themselves with insulin throughout the day, and they are also it's also very important that they monitor their insulin blood level, so that maintains a really good blood glucose level as well, okay? There are different approaches that have been taken. So there are some forms of insulin that have been genetically engineered to either act very rapidly, so that might be important in the case of if you'd been exercising, or you hadn't been keeping good track of your blood glucose, and all of a sudden you realize that you need some insulin right now. So that can act very quickly. And there is another one that actually acts over a much longer time than natural insulin. And so what it means that these diabetics can do is inject themselves at night time, and that is enough to sort of last throughout the night. They don't have to wake up at shorter intervals to re-inject more insulin. Another interesting little bit of research, and this has actually been carried out in Auckland, so this is super cool. There is a company called Living Cell Technologies, and what they are trying to do is to take islet cells from pigs, and they are trying to put them back into humans, so these beta cells back into human pancreas, to regenerate the ability to produce insulin, okay? There's a couple of reasons that they use pigs, simply because their tissue is actually very, very similar to us, and our immune systems don't tend to react to them too much. So you may have heard of things like heart valves being generated from pigs and transplanted from pigs into humans and things like that. So this is another one of those approaches. There is also a specific breed of pig that they are using that are disease-free, so there's no worries about any kind of random infection or anything coming along. You're welcome to read through this information here. It's just a little bit more information about what they're doing. All I wanted to point out was that xenotransplantation, although it looks very scary, xeno refers to between species, so it's just a transplantation between species. Okay, so even with these abilities to inject insulin in order to control blood glucose in type 1 diabetics, it can still be very difficult, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, diabetics are injecting insulin under their skin, so that's what subcutaneous means. Under cutaneous, it's kind of like your cuticle layer or the skin layer. Whereas normal insulin is being produced from within the pancreas, going straight into the liver. So by the time you get the insulin being absorbed into the capillaries and then passing into the veins and then through the heart and back down to the liver, it can be quite a while before that happens. And secondly, it can actually lose its potency on the way, basically. Even though we talked previously that there was a specific genetically engineered super fast insulin, a lot of the insulin that people use is not that type, and so it can take a lot longer to act compared to insulin that your body would have generated directly. And lastly, the beta cells are a really good receptor and control center. So they are continuously detecting the blood glucose level and deciding what to do, whether to like stimulate insulin release, or the alpha cells that they're detecting if they need to release glucagon. And so that means that the blood glucose is perfectly balanced, that you're just secreting the right amount of insulin that's needed. Whereas with a patient injecting insulin, you're kind of making a best guess based on historic data and also your own treatment as to how much insulin you should be adding. So all up just not quite as accurate or efficient as normal insulin would be. So just another little note about type 1 diabetics controlling glucose blood level. It's very important that their glucose levels are controlled, because if they drop down too much, they become hypoglycemic, and that means that their brain is not functioning properly and they're likely to enter into coma and then death. But if not enough insulin is used, then they can get really high blood glucose level, and this is hyperglycemia. As you know, that is not dangerous really in the short term, but it's more in the long term damage that it can do to the body. It's interesting to note that these lovely little blood glucose detectors and monitors, that they just take a little finger prick blood sample, and this was only about 20 years ago that these started being developed, that people with diabetes could actually start managing their disease at home by themselves. And prior to that, they needed to go and have a blood test every single day, and they were really just guessing as to how much insulin they should be adding on a daily basis. So it was a much less convenient, it was a much more rudimentary way of managing the disease, and no doubt the patients that were managing it prior to these little monitors probably didn't have quite as good outcomes as the patients do these days. This one is just a little bit more detail about what happens if you don't treat it. So we talked about this a little bit. Glucose ends up building up more in the blood because it's not being taken up by these tissues. And what this means is that these tissues are going to start to use up fats and amino acids, and so people can actually waste away. They can lose a lot of muscle, they can lose a lot of fat in their body, and even though they're eating plenty of food, their body is not able to make use of that food. And as we were talking about previously, if you use up too much fat for energy, it produces these things called ketone bodies, which can actually build up in the blood. And as I said previously, you can actually smell this on the breath of people that are not managing their diabetes well. Isn't that lovely? So smelling people's breath, it smells like nail polish remover, and then tasting their pee, which tastes like sweet honey. Great testing. And so basically, but these are acidic, these ketone bodies, and so if it's not treated, if these build up over a long period of time, it can actually completely acidify the pH of their blood, and this becomes very, very serious, very dangerous. This is just a little bit of background information about how people have been using insulin as a therapy, because previously to discovering that the pancreas was involved and that insulin was involved, people with type 1 diabetes would just die very early in their lives because they couldn't manage their blood glucose, and they did get this ketoacidosis and lots of the other sort of wasting diseases. So very interesting that these scientists discovered that it was something that was made in the pancreas. They didn't really know what it was back at that time, and what they actually did was that they chopped up lots of pigs and cows and took their pancreases out and purified it and shoved it back into people, and it worked. And that was this miracle cure, because until then there was nothing that you could do for these people, and they just died. And so this chopped up pancreas stuff actually saved the lives of many people. Finally, it wasn't until the 1980s when they sort of figured out this insulin gene, and they cloned it, and they were able to produce it, and it was actually the very first protein that was produced by genetic engineering, simply because the demand for this protein was so high. And during the 1990s, and no doubt since then as well, there have been more sort of forms of insulin generated to become more efficient and more just sort of smarter working. Okay, just some very quick quiz questions focusing on type 1 diabetes. So I'll read through these just quickly. You guys can pause the video, write down your answers, and then we'll come back and go through them, okay? So what I'm wanting you to do is come up with what type 1 diabetes is caused by, what are the symptoms, how is it diagnosed, and also how is it treated. Okay, so pause the video now and write down your answers. Okay, so let's run through those answers together. So type 1 diabetes is caused by basically a destruction of the beta cells within the islets of Langerhans, and this means that no insulin is produced. Current thinking is that it is an autoimmune disease that either has some kind of genetic predisposition but may have environmental factors involved also. The symptoms of type 1 diabetes, some of them are excessive urine, thirst, hunger, weight loss. We also know that the urine can become sort of sweet with all the glucose in it, and you can also smell ketone bodies or this ketoacidosis on somebody's breath. How do we diagnose it? We do not diagnose it by smelling breath and tasting pee, and in fact it is through a fasting blood glucose level. So you fast for 12 hours, they take your blood, they check what the level is, and if that comes back as being reasonably high, and I believe the magic number was 126 or something, and then basically that is a pretty strong indicator that you have some kind of diabetes. How is it treated? Injection of insulin, and that's really the only way that there is to treat type 1 diabetes. Okay, next video will be type 2 diabetes.